When did you realize your husband had completely lost it? My husband had always been competitive with our neighbors, but when they upgraded their Christmas display, he completely cracked. We're spending our savings on Christmas lights because the Johnsons can't have a better display than us, my husband announced. I already ordered $50,000 worth of decorations. We need that money for our daughter's college tuition, I said, staring at the invoice he was waving. College can wait. I won't let them emasculate me, he said, pointing at the Johnsons' synchronized light show that had cars stopping to watch. They have 40,000 lights and we're going to have 80,000. This is insane and I'm not letting you drain our savings over lawn decorations, I said. Either you support me in this or I'll tell everyone at your office Christmas party that you're the reason our house looks pathetic, he said, already unloading boxes of lights from a truck I hadn't noticed in our driveway. The Johnsons think they own Christmas on this street and I'm going to destroy them. Our daughter heard everything and asked if she was still going to college next year. 3 weeks later, he sued the Johnsons for creating a public nuisance with their display, claiming their lights were causing him emotional distress by making our house look inferior. He hired a lawyer to argue that their decorations violated neighborhood aesthetic standards that didn't exist, and he tried to get a restraining order preventing them from turning on their lights. He actually got the HOA involved even though we didn't have an HOA, creating a fake one and sending out official-looking letters demanding everyone vote on Christmas light limits. The Johnsons' lawyer sent a cease and desist letter, but my husband stood in our yard with a megaphone announcing that the Johnsons were trying to monopolize Christmas joy, and he wouldn't stand for it. After losing every legal avenue, he waited until the Johnsons went on vacation and built a massive plywood wall between our properties to block their display from the street. He'd constructed a 40-foot barrier overnight and painted it to look like snow, then projection mapped his own light show onto it using 20 projectors he'd bought with our retirement fund. The wall fell over during the first windstorm and crushed the Johnsons' display, causing $30,000 in damage. But instead of apologizing, he celebrated in the front yard screaming that he'd won by default. The Johnsons came home to find their decorations destroyed, and my husband on our roof installing a 60-foot inflatable Santa that violated every city ordinance about residential structures. He decided to ensure victory by creating the world's brightest Christmas display using industrial lighting from a construction site he'd robbed at night. He stole generator-powered floodlights meant for highway work and connected them all to our house's electrical system, then added concert-grade lasers he'd bought on the black market that were technically illegal for residential use. He was running 7 generators in our backyard, and the noise was so loud that neighbors 3 blocks away complained, but he kept adding more lights until our house looked like a nuclear reactor. He tried to add a real helicopter with Christmas lights on the rotors to hover over our house, teaching himself to fly using YouTube videos, but he crashed it into our garage on the first attempt. Instead of stopping, he bought another helicopter and tried again, this time clipping power lines that knocked out electricity for the entire neighborhood except our house, which was running on generators. He climbed the power pole himself to try to restore power while keeping our display running, but he grabbed the wrong wire and electrocuted himself so badly that his heart stopped for 3 minutes. When the paramedics revived him, he was still holding strings of lights and demanding they help him install them, but his nervous system was so damaged from the electrocution that he couldn't stop convulsing and his hands were burned down to exposed bone. "You made me electrocute myself because you wouldn't support my Christmas display," he told me in the burn unit while they debrided his charred flesh. "I have permanent nerve damage because you wouldn't help me beat the Johnsons. You stole industrial equipment and crashed 2 helicopters into our house," I said, but his mother slapped me. "He's permanently disabled because you couldn't support your husband's holiday spirit," she said, while he twitched uncontrollably from the nerve damage. "Our house was condemned from the electrical damage and structural instability from the helicopter crashes, and the city sued us for $2 million in infrastructure damage, while insurance refused to cover any of it since he'd admitted to stealing the equipment in front of witnesses." The Johnsons moved away after my husband's friends started harassing them for driving him to this point, and everyone in the neighborhood blamed me for not just helping him put up lights in the first place. Our daughter couldn't go to college because the money was gone, and she looked at me with disgust, saying I'd ruined her future by not supporting her father's one simple wish. My husband's family banned me from the hospital room where he was learning to use his destroyed hands, saying I didn't deserve to see him after what I'd caused. I was sleeping in my car outside our condemned house, still covered in melted Christmas lights, and I could see my husband's friends inside stealing whatever wasn't destroyed to help fund his medical bills. While everyone agreed that none of this would have happened if I'd just been a supportive wife about Christmas decorations. The sun started coming up, and I sat up in my car seat, my neck stiff from sleeping against the window. 2 more of my husband's friends were walking out through our broken front door carrying our flat-screen TV between them. They saw me watching through the windshield, but didn't even try to hide what they were doing. They just loaded it into the back of their truck while talking about which medical equipment my husband needed most for his nerve damage. I watched them go back inside for more stuff, and my phone buzzed with a text from my daughter. She said she wouldn't speak to me until I apologized to her father for ruining his life. I stared at the message for a long time but didn't respond, because there was nothing I could say that she'd hear right now. Not when her grandmother had been filling her head with poison for weeks. I started my car and drove to the public library since I needed to use their computer. The librarian recognized me from the news coverage but gave me a sympathetic look instead of judging. I logged onto the GoFundMe page his friends had started, and my stomach turned at all the lies they'd written about me abandoning him. They claimed I'd refused to help with his medical care and left him to suffer alone. I took screenshots of everything, page after page of comments calling me horrible names. The printer kept jamming, but I got 50 pages of evidence printed while the librarian pretended not to notice how many copies I was making. That afternoon, while I was organizing the papers in my car, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. A woman named Moira Welch introduced herself as working for the city's risk management office. She wanted to meet about the infrastructure damage from the helicopters and power lines. She said if I cooperated with their investigation, they might work out a payment plan instead of demanding immediate collection of the full $2 million. I wrote down the meeting time on a napkin from my glove compartment. My phone rang again while I was still sitting in the library parking lot. It was my boss, and my hand started shaking when I saw his name on the screen. He said there had been talk at the office about my husband's Christmas party threat from months ago. HR was concerned about the company's reputation being connected to all this chaos. They were putting me on administrative review starting immediately. I asked if I was fired, but he said they needed to investigate first. After the call ended, I drove past the hospital because I needed to see if my husband was okay despite everything. His mother's car was in the visitor section, and I parked far away to watch. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes before a security guard knocked on my window. He said I needed to leave or they'd call the police since I was on the banned visitor list. I drove away with tears in my eyes. The hospital billing department called while I was stopped at a red light. They said I needed to make decisions about my husband's ongoing care since we were still legally married. When I explained his mother had banned me from seeing him, they said she was trying to get power of attorney. They needed my signature on the forms, or they'd have to go through the courts. I told them I'd think about it, but I had no idea what to do. 2 days later, I was back at the library using their computers when my husband's friends showed up. They started telling everyone in the computer area that I was the reason their friend was disabled. They said I could have prevented everything if I'd just helped him put up Christmas lights. The librarian called security and the friends were removed, but she told me I couldn't come back for a while. Now I had nowhere to go during the day and no way to use a computer. I found Dalton Hart's name through legal aid and met him at his tiny office downtown. He looked tired but listened to my whole story without interrupting. He said we could file for a restraining order against the friends who kept harassing me. But he warned me it might make the community harassment worse since everyone already thought I was the bad guy. I signed the paperwork anyway because I couldn't take much more. My daughter called that night while I was eating crackers for dinner in my car. She was crying because she couldn't register for spring classes without the tuition money. I tried to explain that the money was gone, spent on lights and helicopters and legal fees. She screamed that I should have just helped him with the display in the first place. She said I'd destroyed her future over my stubbornness about some Christmas decorations. She hung up on me when I tried to explain that her father had stolen industrial equipment and crashed helicopters into our house. I sat in my car outside the condemned house and watched the melted lights still hanging from what was left of the roof. Everything I'd worked for my whole life was gone because my husband couldn't stand the neighbors having better decorations. My phone started ringing while I was trying to sleep, and the screen showed a number I didn't recognize. The woman on the other end said she was calling from Capital One about an overdue payment on an account opened 3 months ago. I told her I didn't have a Capital One card, but she read off my social security number and asked if that was correct. My hand started shaking as she explained the account had a $12,000 balance and hadn't been paid in 60 days. She said the primary cardholder was my husband, but I was listed as an authorized user, which made me equally responsible for the debt. I asked her to send me the statements, and she said they'd been going to our house, which was now condemned and wrapped in caution tape. 5 more calls came in over the next hour from different credit card companies, all saying the same thing about accounts I'd never seen. American Express wanted $8,000, Chase wanted $15,000, and Discover wanted $6,000. All opened in the last 4 months using both our names. The total came to over $40,000 my husband had secretly borrowed to fund his Christmas war against the Johnsons. I drove to the library to use their computer and search for rooms to rent since I couldn't keep sleeping in my car forever. Most places wanted first and last month's rent plus security deposit, which I couldn't afford with our accounts frozen. I found one listing for a basement room on the other side of town that only wanted $500 to move in. The landlady met me at the property, and her eyes got narrow when I explained why I needed a place so urgently. She kept looking at my car with our belongings piled in the back seat and asked if I was going to cause any trouble. I promised her I just needed somewhere quiet to sleep and figure out my next steps. She took my cash and handed me a key to a door around the back of the house that led down to a small room with concrete walls and a single window near the ceiling. The carpet was damp and smelled like mold, but there was a bed and a tiny bathroom, so it was better than my car. I was loading my clothes into the room when a woman with a camera showed up at my car, asking if I was the wife from the Christmas decoration incident. She said she was a reporter from the local news and wanted my side of the story for a piece about holiday competition gone wrong. I told her I had nothing to say, but she kept following me to the basement door saying she'd already interviewed the neighbors and my husband's family. She said the story was running tomorrow with or without my input, and this was my chance to defend myself. I went inside and locked the door while she shouted through it that everyone deserved to hear both sides. My phone rang again, but this time it was a law firm representing the Johnsons about their civil suit for the destroyed decorations. The lawyer explained that since my husband and I were married when he knocked down their display with his wall, I was equally liable for the $30,000 in damages. He said they'd prefer to settle out of court, but if I didn't respond within 10 days, they'd file for a judgment that would follow me forever. My stomach twisted into knots as I realized the bills just kept getting bigger, and there was no end in sight. I called Dalton back and told him about the Johnsons' lawsuit, and he said I needed to file for legal separation immediately. He explained that any new debts or damages my husband created after the separation filing would be his alone, not mine. The paperwork would cost $300 to file, but it would protect me from whatever else he might do from his hospital bed. I met Dalton at his office and signed the forms while my hands shook because it felt like I was abandoning my husband when he was hurt. He told me this wasn't about abandonment, but about financial survival since my husband had already destroyed our entire future. 3 days later, I was at the grocery store buying ramen noodles with the last $20 in my wallet when my husband's mother appeared in the cereal aisle. She started screaming that I was a gold digger trying to steal half of everything while her son was fighting for his life. Other shoppers stopped to stare as she told them all how I'd refused to help with the Christmas lights and caused his injuries. She said I was filing for separation to take his disability payments and leave him with nothing. The store manager asked her to leave, but she kept yelling that everyone should know what kind of person I really was. My phone rang while I was trying to get away from her, and it was my boss saying HR needed to discuss the situation. He said the company had been getting calls about me and negative reviews mentioning my name in connection with the Christmas incident. They were placing me on unpaid leave while they investigated whether my personal situation was affecting the company's reputation. I tried to explain that I hadn't done anything wrong, but he said the decision came from corporate and was effective immediately. I sat in my damp basement room that night eating dry cereal and wondering how much worse things could get. Moira called the next morning asking me to come to her office to discuss the city's damages in detail. She had a stack of invoices and reports covering everything from the power grid repairs to the helicopter removal costs. The power company needed $150,000 to fix the lines my husband damaged when he crashed the second helicopter. The city spent $40,000 on emergency response between the fires, the electrocution, and the structural damage to our house. Road repairs from where the helicopters hit the pavement came to $30,000. She said if I cooperated fully and provided all the information about my husband's actions, they might reduce the total by 40%. I gave her everything I knew about where he got the helicopters and the industrial lights he stole. 2 days later, a detective called saying he needed my statement about the stolen equipment and illegal helicopter flights. He came to the basement and took notes while I explained how my husband had taught himself to fly using YouTube videos. I showed him the credit card statements I'd been collecting that showed purchases from aircraft dealers. He said my cooperation was helpful in establishing that I wasn't involved in the thefts or flights. While I was gathering documents for the separation filing at what was left of our house, I found a box of papers hidden in the garage that survived the helicopter crash. Inside were credit card applications with my signature that I'd never signed, and statements going back 6 months before the Christmas competition even started. My husband had been opening secret accounts and forging my name long before the Johnsons upgraded their display. The fraud totaled over $70,000 that I was supposedly responsible for as the co-signer. I stared at those forged signatures for a long time before putting the papers in my bag and driving to the police station. The detective who'd been assigned to the helicopter thefts took one look at the documents and said he'd add fraud to the investigation. My daughter finally agreed to meet me at a coffee shop downtown the next day, but when I got there, she wasn't alone. Her grandmother sat beside her glaring at me while my daughter stared at her phone. I tried to explain that community college was still an option with financial aid and grants available. Her grandmother cut me off saying I was the most selfish woman she'd ever met. My daughter wouldn't even look at me as they both stood up and walked out without ordering anything. 2 days later, the detective called me back to take my full statement about everything that had happened. He asked detailed questions about the timeline and took notes about every purchase and theft my husband had committed. When I finished, he looked at me and said it was clear I was a victim in this situation, not an accomplice. He said my cooperation would help with the criminal cases against my husband for the thefts and illegal flights. The next morning, I had to go back to our condemned house with police supervision to get important documents. 3 of my husband's friends were there loading our furniture into a truck when we pulled up. They started shouting that I was a traitor and a terrible wife as I walked past them. The officer stayed close while I went through the debris looking for birth certificates and tax records. I found our marriage certificate under a pile of melted Christmas lights and almost laughed at the irony. The friends kept yelling about how I'd abandoned my husband when he needed me most. One of them threw a broken ornament at me, but the officer stepped between us. I gathered what papers I could find and left without responding to any of their accusations. That afternoon, the hospital called asking me to attend a care conference about my husband's treatment plan. The social worker explained that his cognitive function was severely impaired from the electrocution damage to his brain. He would need at least 6 months of inpatient rehabilitation that insurance would only partially cover. They needed me to sign papers as his spouse even though his mother had been making all the decisions. I signed what they needed and left before his mother could corner me in the hallway. The next day, the Johnsons' lawyer called suggesting we try mediation instead of going to trial. He said his clients just wanted their damages covered and a formal apology for what happened. It was the first reasonable conversation I'd had with anyone in weeks about this mess. We scheduled a mediation session for the following week at his office downtown. That night, I finally moved into the basement rental I'd found across town. After weeks of sleeping in my car, lying down in an actual bed felt strange and uncomfortable. The ceiling leaked in the corner and I could hear mice in the walls. But compared to my car, it was luxury, and I slept for 12 hours straight. The next morning, I filed the legal separation papers Dalton had prepared for me. Within hours, someone had posted about it on the neighborhood Facebook page. By evening, there was a whole page called Support Tom, Abandon the Witch, with my photo as the profile picture. People I'd never met were commenting about what a horrible person I was. Some posted photos of our destroyed house saying I'd caused all of it. Others shared stories they'd heard third hand about how I'd refused to help with decorations. My boss called that afternoon saying they needed to meet with me about my employment status. When I got to the office, HR was there with a termination letter already printed. They said the controversy was affecting the company's reputation, and they had to let me go. 20 years with the company gone because my husband went crazy over Christmas lights. I cleaned out my desk while my former coworkers avoided eye contact with me. The next day, I went to the unemployment office to file for benefits. The forms asked why I'd lost my job, and I had to write an explanation. I wrote "husband's Christmas decoration obsession" in the box, and the clerk looked at me strangely. She processed my application without asking questions, but I could tell she thought I was lying. I also had to apply for food stamps since I had no income and no savings left. The welfare office was crowded, and I waited 3 hours to see someone about my application. When I explained my situation, the caseworker just nodded and handed me more forms to fill out. Later that week, Moira called asking me to come discuss a potential settlement with the city. She laid out all the damages again, but said she had a proposal from the city council. If I agreed to 500 hours of community service and a 30-year payment plan, they'd reduce the claim by 40%. It would still be crushing debt, but better than the full $2 million they could pursue. I told her I'd think about it, but we both knew I didn't have any other options. She gave me a week to decide and said the offer wouldn't be available after that. I left her office and sat in my car doing the math on what 30 years of payments would look like. Even with the reduction, it would take most of any income I could earn for the rest of my working life. My phone rang as I walked to my car, and the school counselor's name showed on the screen. She told me my daughter had been missing classes and her grades were dropping fast. The counselor said she'd been crying in the bathroom between periods and snapping at teachers who asked if she was okay. When I asked if I could come talk to her, the counselor hesitated before saying my daughter had specifically asked that I not be contacted. She suggested family counseling might help, but my daughter had already said she wouldn't go to any sessions if I was there. The counselor gave me the name of a therapist anyway, and said she was worried about signs of depression. I sat in my car outside Moira's office building holding that piece of paper with the therapist's number, while other cars honked at me to move. 3 days later, a process server knocked on the door of my basement rental at 6 in the morning. The paper said my husband's mother was filing for emergency guardianship of him, because I was unfit to make his medical decisions. She claimed I'd abandoned him in his time of need and couldn't be trusted with his care. The court date was set for next week, and the paper said I needed to appear or lose by default. I couldn't afford a lawyer, but Dalton said he'd try to help even though this wasn't his area. He spent 2 hours going through the guardianship laws with me and helped me write a response to file with the court. The morning of the hearing, I wore my only clean outfit and sat in the courtroom while my husband's mother told the judge I was a monster who'd caused her son's injuries. She brought photos of him in the hospital with his burned hands wrapped in gauze and machines keeping him stable. Her lawyer argued that I'd shown no interest in his recovery and had filed for separation while he was fighting for his life. When my turn came, I explained that she'd banned me from the hospital and that I'd only filed for separation to protect myself from more debt. The judge listened to both sides for 2 hours before saying neither of us should have guardianship. He appointed a neutral third-party guardian from the state who would make medical decisions based on what was best for my husband. My mother-in-law jumped up screaming that I'd stolen her son from her and that the judge was corrupt. Security had to escort her out while she yelled that everyone would hear about this injustice. The guardian introduced herself afterward and said she'd be reviewing all of my husband's care and would make decisions based on medical recommendations, not family drama. That night my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered it was my husband's voice, slurred and slow from the brain damage. He kept saying my name wrong, calling me by his mother's name sometimes, then switching back to blaming me for the lights. I could hear his mother in the background telling him what to say, coaching him to ask about money and insurance. He cried about wanting more lights for next Christmas, and then accused me of hiding his decorations. His speech got worse as he got upset, turning into sounds that weren't quite words anymore. His mother took the phone and said this was all my fault before hanging up. The next week, Dalton called with good news about the mediation with the Johnsons. They'd agreed to meet and were willing to discuss a payment plan instead of demanding everything up front. At the mediation, they sat across from me looking tired, more than angry. They said they understood my husband was the real problem, and they didn't want to destroy me financially when I was clearly a victim too. We worked out a deal where I'd pay them $200 a month for 10 years to cover their damaged decorations. They even offered to write a statement for anyone who asked that I wasn't responsible for what happened. It was the first time in months someone had shown me any kindness. The district attorney's office contacted me the following week about my husband's criminal charges for the theft and aviation violations. They were offering him a plea deal that would avoid jail time due to his medical condition, but would include probation and restitution. The prosecutor asked if I wanted to submit a victim impact statement since I'd suffered financial harm from his actions. Dalton helped me write 3 pages explaining how my husband's choices had destroyed our savings, our home, and our daughter's future. I detailed every financial loss and included documents showing the debts he'd created without my knowledge. The prosecutor said it was one of the clearest victim impact statements she'd seen. That weekend, my phone buzzed with a text from my daughter for the first time in over a month. She said she'd gone to visit her dad and found her grandmother screaming at the nurses about his care. Her grandmother had called one nurse stupid and thrown a cup of water at another who wouldn't break hospital rules for her. My daughter said she was starting to see a different side of her grandmother and was questioning some of the things she'd been told. She didn't apologize, but it was the first crack in the wall between us. I started looking for work anywhere that would hire me, filling out applications at grocery stores and fast food places. Most places Googled my name and never called back, but finally a warehouse on the edge of town said they needed night shift workers and didn't care about my past. The job involved moving boxes for 8 hours starting at 11 at night and paid minimum wage with no benefits. I took it immediately because any income was better than nothing. The manager said as long as I showed up on time and worked hard, he didn't care what my personal situation was. The bankruptcy lawyer I met with through legal aid explained my options while spreading out all the debts on his desk. He said I could discharge the credit card debts my husband had created with forged signatures, but the city liens and criminal restitution would stay with me. Even with bankruptcy, I'd be paying for his Christmas light war for decades. He helped me fill out the paperwork and said at least this would stop the credit card companies from calling every hour. It wasn't a fresh start, but it was better than drowning in fraudulent debt. My daughter finally agreed to meet me alone at a coffee shop near her school. She showed up 10 minutes late and wouldn't make eye contact at first. She was still angry and said she might never forgive me for not just helping Dad with the lights in the first place. But she also admitted she'd seen how her grandmother twisted situations and lied to people to get her way. She said she was confused about what was real and what was manipulation. We sat there for an hour not saying much, but it was a start. She let me hug her when she left, even though she stayed stiff in my arms. I watched her walk to her car and drive away before heading back to my own beat-up sedan. 2 days later, the mediator called saying the Johnsons had agreed to the settlement terms we'd discussed. I'd pay them $200 every month for 10 years to cover the damage my husband caused to their display. They even agreed to tell anyone who asked that I wasn't responsible for what happened to their decorations. The relief hit me so hard I had to sit down in the warehouse break room. My supervisor noticed and asked if I was okay, but I just nodded and went back to moving boxes. That same week, Dalton called about my husband's criminal case. The prosecutor had offered him a plea deal for probation, plus restitution he'd never be able to pay because of his disabilities. His mother showed up at the courthouse screaming that I should have hired him a better lawyer with money we didn't have. The judge had to threaten her with contempt before she'd stop yelling about how I'd ruined her son's life. I kept working my night shifts at the warehouse and showing up on time every single night. When one of the day shift workers quit without notice, my supervisor pulled me aside. She said the full-time position was mine if I wanted it, and she didn't care about my past as long as I kept working hard. The extra hours meant more money, and I took every shift they'd give me. After 3 months of saving, I finally had enough for first and last month's rent on a small studio apartment. The basement rental had been getting worse with more leaks and the landlady watching my every move. The studio was empty except for an air mattress I bought at a thrift store and a folding chair someone left behind. But it was clean and safe, and nobody could kick me out as long as I paid rent. My daughter texted me one day that she'd enrolled in community college using grants and student loans. She'd finally accepted that the college savings were gone forever, thanks to her dad's Christmas light war. She started sending me updates about her classes and which professors were good or bad. We weren't close yet, but at least she was talking to me again without her grandmother coaching her. Spring came and turned into summer, and one day I had to drive near our old neighborhood for a community service assignment. I took a detour past our old street and saw the condemned house had been demolished completely. The lot sat empty with just dirt and some weeds starting to grow where our home used to be. It looked peaceful without the melted lights and crashed helicopter debris. Moira from the city called me that week about reducing my community service hours. She said I was one of the few people who actually followed through on these agreements without missing assignments. They cut my required hours in half, which meant I could work more shifts at the warehouse. Around that same time, the hospital called saying my husband was transferred to a long-term care facility. The doctors had decided he'd never fully recover from the nerve damage and brain injury from the electrocution. His mother still blamed me, but she'd stopped calling and showing up at my work after the restraining order was granted. She could only communicate through lawyers now, which meant blessed silence most days. At the warehouse, I kept my head down and worked hard every shift without complaining. When the previous shift supervisor got fired for stealing inventory, the manager offered me the position. It came with health insurance for the first time in months, and a small raise that meant I could actually save money. My coworkers didn't know about the Christmas lights or the helicopters or any of it. They just knew me as someone who showed up and did the job without causing problems. My daughter called one evening asking if we could have dinner together. We met at a cheap diner halfway between her school and my apartment. She looked tired from studying and working her own part-time job to pay for books and gas. Halfway through our meal, she started crying and apologizing for believing I was the villain in everything. She said she'd been scared and confused when everything fell apart, and her grandmother had been so convincing. She'd seen how her dad's obsession destroyed everything, but at the time she couldn't process it properly. We sat there for 2 hours talking about everything that had happened since that December night. She told me about her classes and her plans to transfer to a 4-year school eventually. I told her about the warehouse job and my tiny apartment and how I was slowly paying off the debts. When we hugged goodbye this time, she held on tight instead of staying stiff. She said she'd call me next week and maybe we could have dinner again soon. I drove back to my empty studio and sat on my folding chair looking at the bare walls. It wasn't much, but it was mine and nobody could take it away over Christmas decorations. The Johnson settlement payment was due in 3 days and I had the money saved already. My husband would spend years in that care facility with his mother visiting and blaming everyone but him. Our daughter would finish community college and move on with her life despite everything. And I'd keep getting up every day and going to work and rebuilding piece by piece. Because that's what you do when someone's insanity burns your whole life to the ground. You sweep up the ashes and start over even when everyone says it's your fault for not being supportive enough. 3 weeks later, I walked into the bankruptcy court with all my paperwork, while the judge looked at the credit card statements my husband had hidden from me. He'd opened 12 cards in my name using my social security number and maxed them all out buying Christmas stuff and helicopters and construction equipment he thought he needed. The judge signed the papers that would clear most of it away, but warned me the damage to my credit would last 7 years, and I'd still owe the city for the power lines and road repairs. That same week, one of my husband's friends got caught breaking into the Petersons' house 3 streets over trying to steal their TV to sell for my husband's medical bills. The cops arrested him and found stolen stuff from 4 other houses in his garage, and suddenly people started wondering if maybe my husband's friends weren't the good guys they pretended to be. The friend tried to blame me for everything, saying I drove them to steal by not helping my husband, but the judge didn't buy it and sent him to jail for 2 years. After that, the other friends stopped coming around and stopped posting about me online because they didn't want the cops looking at them too. I found a support group that met at the community center on Tuesday nights for people who'd been financially abused by their spouses. There were 8 other women and 2 men sitting in metal chairs drinking bad coffee and talking about how their partners had destroyed their lives with spending and debts and lies. One woman's husband had spent their retirement on a boat he crashed the first day. Another's wife had gambled away their house on online poker, and hearing their stories made me realize this wasn't about Christmas lights or me not being supportive enough. My daughter called me after her 2nd semester at community college to tell me she'd changed her major to social work. She said watching our family fall apart had shown her how one person's mental problems could destroy everything, and she wanted to help other families before they ended up like us. She was working 30 hours a week at a grocery store to pay for classes and living with 3 roommates in a tiny apartment, but she sounded stronger than she had in months. We started having dinner every Sunday at the same cheap place, and she'd tell me about her psychology classes and how she was learning about personality disorders and financial abuse and family systems. One evening, she looked at me and said she was sorry for blaming me when Dad went crazy, that she'd been young and scared and Grandma had been so loud and sure about whose fault it was. A year after that December when everything exploded, I was working full-time at the warehouse with benefits and had saved enough to move into a 1-bedroom apartment with actual furniture instead of folding chairs. My daughter was doing well in the school, and we talked twice a week, and I'd even made a friend at work who didn't know anything about the helicopters or the lawsuits. Life wasn't what I'd planned when I was married with a house and savings, but it was quiet and stable, and nobody was stealing generators or crashing aircraft into my garage. Then in November, a card showed up at my apartment with the Johnsons' return address, and inside was a simple Christmas card with a note saying they'd heard about everything that happened, and they hoped I was doing okay. It was the first time I'd looked at anything Christmas-related without wanting to throw up, and I actually kept the card on my kitchen counter for a week before putting it away. My daughter graduated from community college that spring with a 3.8 GPA and got accepted to the state university with enough scholarships and grants to cover most of her costs. At her graduation, she hugged me and whispered that I'd taught her how to survive when everything goes wrong, how to get up every day and keep going even when the whole world is against you. She moved into the dorms that fall and called me crying happy tears her first night because she'd made it to a real university despite everything. 2 years after the Christmas disaster, I was driving to work one December morning and passed a house covered in lights and inflatable decorations and those moving reindeer things. I waited for the anger or the panic or the sick feeling, but nothing came. I just drove past like it was any other house with any other decorations, and the $50,000 light display that had destroyed my entire life had finally lost its power over me. That's all I've got for today, friends. Thanks for hanging out and sharing this little slice of life with me. If you want to stick around for more good vibes, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button.